Aerial resupply means not only materiel, but manpower as well. The Army Air Mobile Team's ability to rush reinforcements by helicopter and move troop units to keep up with rapidly changing situations on the ground has led to some of the Viet Cong's most crushing defeats. The enemy could not anticipate the reaction timing of this swift air mobility. Keeping the swarms of helicopters airborne so long and so often is made possible only because the team gives these aircraft expert maintenance on the ground. Checkups and inspection procedures are exacting and carried out according to a rigid schedule. After every combat mission, an inspection is made for possible damage.
In 1969, I was 19 years old, and I had just graduated high school. I graduated high school late, and in that summer of that year, I didn't have a job. I needed a job, and it occurred to me that maybe the best way to get a job would be to join the military. So I got on my motorcycle. I went down to the recruiter. And I joined the Army. It kind of put you in a frame of mind that maybe that's what you wanted to do. You wanted to be a hero. And I think that's pretty much why I joined the Army. It wasn't out of patriotism. It was out of not having a job, and that was an option for me to join the Army. I had gone to aviation high school in Queens, and in aviation I majored in power plants, and at the end of my graduation you take an FAA exam, and I passed the FAA exam to get my power plant license. And to have a complete ticket you needed an airframe and power plants, and in order for me to get the airframe portion of the FAA license, I needed to be trained in it, and the Army offered airframe repair. So I went to the recruiter, and they told me that they would send me to airframe repair school, where I would learn how to become an aircraft technician majoring in airframes. And they guaranteed me that I would do that. I didn't eventually do it, but they guaranteed it. And that's why I joined the Army too. You know, we were in a war zone, and you had expectations of what was to come. My first night in my unit, 3rd to the 17th, I was in a hooch, and I entered the hooch in the middle of the night, and everybody else was sleeping, and I took a lower bunk. And right outside of the hooch was a mortar company that was proceeded to send out mortars. I had never heard a mortar go off. I didn't know the distinction between outgoing and incoming, and I was scared to death. I heard the first explosion of outgoing, and I thought I was going to jump out of the bed, and I was fully prepared to do it, to jump under the bed, and I looked around me, and everybody else was still sleeping. And it didn't bother anybody. And that was my first experience with any kind of firing in Vietnam. I think I saw a movie at one point where the new guys were coming in and the old guys were going out. That actually happened. You know, when I was going in, we formed a line from the airplane. We flew Braniff Airlines going into Vietnam. And the guys going out, they had dirty fatigues, they had boonie caps, their boots were dyed red from the mud. They looked total veterans. They were total veterans. And I looked at myself and the guys that I was with, and we had green, total green, starched fatigues. We looked so brand new compared to these veterans going out. And I thought to myself, I remember this, that in a year from now, I should look like that. And in a year from then, that's what I looked like. As an air cavalry unit, we moved to 3 places when I was there. We started off in Xi'an. And prior to the, I think a month prior to the Cambodian invasion, we moved closer to the border. We moved to a place called Quan Loy. We stayed on that hill for about 10 months. I did 2 tours in Vietnam. At the end of the 10th month, period in Quan Loy, we moved down to Lai Khe, further southeast. Well, Cambodian invasion was big for me. We had an operation on the Song Bay River, which was also big for me and my unit. During the Cambodian invasion, I was in a maintenance platoon fixing helicopter engines as they would come in and require repair. I stayed awake for 3 solid days during that Cambodian invasion. The longest period of my life I had stayed awake. I literally got no sleep for 3 days. And after a period of time, I realized that I didn't need any sleep. I started speeding after a while, and I realized that. And at the end of the 3 days, I couldn't sleep. And they actually gave me a medal for that. When I was in Vietnam, I had no feeling of patriotism. I mean, I wasn't against the war, I wasn't for the war. I wanted to go to Vietnam because I was curious about it. When I was in high school, I read a lot of history. I mean, I still do. I love history. And I noticed that, throughout all of human history, the one constant was that everybody went to war all the time. And I was totally curious. And I wanted to see it. I had no sense of patriotism. I just wanted to see it. When I was in Vietnam, the thing that I fought for were my friends. My friends around me, I knew I could trust them, and I actually loved them. I loved those guys that I was with. My friends in Vietnam were the best friends I ever had, and I would have died for them. And if I was fighting for anything, I was fighting for them. Vietnam was like a milestone that you're one way before you reach that milestone, but once you pass that milestone, you're totally different. I went to Vietnam as a kid. I became somebody else while I was in Vietnam, and when I came home from Vietnam, I was something else again. Vietnam definitely changes people. Any branch of service will change you. Being involved in a war, I think, changes you even further. I was definitely not the person I was before I went to Vietnam. The change is extremely evident when you come up, when you come home and you're with your friends that had never gone. I grew up with these guys, and I could not relate to them after Vietnam. And I know that they could not relate to me. My frame of reference was 3rd to the 17th was my life. These guys, these kids that I grew up with, they were my age, but they were still focused on certain things that I had no interest in. My focus, they had no interest in my focus. My focus was still Vietnam. For years, it always stayed Vietnam. And I literally lost every friend that I had. And I'm fully aware that it's not their fault, it was my fault. They expected to see me as the Decker that before I went to Vietnam. When I came back, I was not that person. I wrote home a little bit. When I wrote to my parents, it was very generic. I never really told them exactly what was going on. I never, to my friends, I kind of, told them a little more of the truth. But to my mother, especially my mother, I never really, I told her nothing is much happening and, I'm bored and all that, which was farthest from the truth. I didn't write as much as I should. As a matter of fact, my mother and father were separated, and I got a visit from the chaplain at one point when I was in Vietnam. My father lived in Pennsylvania and my mother lived in Brooklyn. And my father hadn't heard from me for months, and he contacted someone. And this chaplain came to me in Vietnam and said, you have to write your father. And I was shocked that he actually had that ability to contact the military to have me write. And I ended up, I wrote him a few letters. The funny thing is Hollywood had a strange way of portraying Vietnam veterans when I came home. I saw these shows on television. They had a fondness of blowing up helicopters on on television shows, and I'd be watching television, and it would be, you know, I'd be very calm, and I'd see a helicopter, it's part of the show, and then all of a sudden someone would shoot at the helicopter and the helicopter would blow up. My stomach, for years after that, my stomach, every time I saw something like that, my stomach would tighten up, and I couldn't watch it any further. The other aspect of Hollywood that was influenced by Vietnam was their portrayal of the Vietnam veteran as a bank robber or a murderer. And for years that happened. You know, for years, it just, every time I'd see something like that, it would just anger me. I became aware that I kept quiet about my experiences in Vietnam. And it wasn't until the first Gulf invasion that it became acceptable to be a veteran. And I recall thinking how angry I was after the first Gulf War, when all these guys came home and they were being applauded, and I was happy for them, but I was angry that when I came home, I was forced into this corner of shame and guilt, and that's what angered me the most about that. And I couldn't watch, for a long time, I couldn't watch any Vietnam movies. I think I saw Platoon. That's pretty much it. During my entire time in Vietnam, I always looked forward to coming home. Everybody wanted to go back take the freedom bird back to the world, and that's what everybody was hoping for. Little did I know that I would feel more comfortable in Vietnam with my friends in Vietnam than I would at home. Because when I finally got home, I did not feel like I belonged there. I felt a certain amount of guilt leaving them there. I felt very guilty that my friends were still in Vietnam and I was home, and whatever hardships or dangers they were in, I was insulated from because I was on the other side of the world, you know, at home. I carried that guilt for a long time, So I have 4 friends that I see that were in my old unit, and we meet once a year, and we all think the same and pretty much talk the same. And that's a strange thing about it, is that Vietnam veterans can communicate with each other like Vietnam veterans can't communicate with anyone else. When I talk to a Vietnam veteran, I feel very comfortable. I feel that the person I'm speaking to understands what I'm saying. When I speak to anyone else, what's the point? Even my wife, I can't really speak to her about it, you know. Well, I had a situation happen to me when I was in Vietnam. I watched a Chinook helicopter turn over on its back, turn upside down. And the helicopter was at approximately 4,000 feet, and it was rocking back and forth like this. And it kept rocking back and forth, and I kept watching it. And I was standing on a berm, looking at this helicopter do this. I'm saying to myself, what? It must be a test flight. I thought it was a test flight. And at one point, it just did this, and it started coming down. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And that helicopter just kept coming down. Further along the perimeter were bunkers, and the guys that were in the bunkers were watching this helicopter come down, and they started taking off, and they started running. At around 1,000 feet, panels started coming off the helicopter, parts started coming off the helicopter. When it hit the ground, I don't remember a sound. I don't recall hearing a sound, but the fireball was immense, and I felt the heat of it. I had a nightmare. That nightmare stayed with me for decades. It was unbelievable. I would wake up in the middle of the night dreaming about that helicopter and the guys that were in it. That didn't leave me for a long, long time. There is one guy on the wall that it really got to me, and I know several people that are on it. But one guy's name was Michael Keys. Mike Keys. You know, in looking at the wall, I noticed that he was born November 4th, 1949, and my birthday is November 5th, 1949. And every birthday that I have, I just think that he'd be my age at this point. He'd be one day older than me, and he's dead. He's not alive anymore. And that really gets me. You know, I had mentioned earlier that I read history, and I love history. I read it a lot. And there's that saying that says that those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. Well, we're condemned to repeat it even if we know it or not. World War I was 20 years before World War II, less than a lifetime. The end of World War II to the Korean War was 5 years. From the Korean War, 1953 to 1963 was 10 years. From the end of Vietnam in 75 for us to the Gulf War was less than 20 years. From the Gulf War, humans can learn all they want from history. They cannot change. I've come to the conclusion that humanity exists as a species that will always go to war. And history can't change that. And the knowledge of history can't change that. That's my belief. I feel that the politicians lost that war. We didn't lose that war. We fought that war and we won every battle. There was no battle that we lost. The war was lost in Washington. It was lost in the streets of New York and Washington, D.C. Anywhere there was a protest, that's how we lost the war. And I see the war that's being fought now, and it upsets me that the military men that are fighting the war know how to win that war against terrorism, but the politician that controls the military men is reluctant to do so. I see the parallel to Vietnam. I see it. It's so clear to me, and I don't think people don't see it now. People aren't aware of Vietnam. They're not going to learn any history from Vietnam. If you go to the average high school kid on the street and you ask them what Vietnam was, I had one kid ask me, where was that, in Africa? That's what they don't teach it in schools. We had been reassigned up to Quan Loy, I think in April of 1970, in preparation for the invasion, which occurred in May, if I'm not mistaken, if I recall correctly, of 1970. I had no idea we were going to go in. I don't think anyone did except maybe the officers. And then one day we got our orders, and our AO was always, our area of operations was always Quan Loy, because we were so close, like we were several kilometers away from the border. During that time that we flew in Cambodia, we stayed in Quan Loy. Actually, we stayed in Quan Loy for about 10 months, if I remember correctly. I think I remember Nixon telling the rest of the world that we were not in Cambodia anymore, that we were out of Cambodia, we were not doing anything. That was total bullshit, because we were in Cambodia. We maybe didn't put American troops in, but we certainly inserted ARVNs in there, and we flew missions in there. We flew hunter-killer teams in Cambodia. Well, you know what we really need to remember about Vietnam? That it's not the soldiers' fault. The politicians put us in war. The politicians lead us in war, and they expect us to fight the war. We fight the war. We fight it to the best of our abilities. I don't think we ever lost a battle in Vietnam, but we lost the war. It wasn't the soldiers' fault. And for soldiers coming home to be stigmatized, I don't know that it'll ever happen again, but I know it happened to me. And if anyone should learn by anything about Vietnam, is never to blame the soldiers, because they're doing exactly what they're told to do, and they're doing it well, with honor. And that's it. Well, the veterans of Vietnam today are grizzled old bastards like me. And that's the way I see them. For many years, I thought of Vietnam every day. Every day I'd wake up and I'd think of Vietnam. Then all of a sudden, Vietnam, and every day, for years, Vietnam always seemed like it was yesterday. But suddenly, Vietnam seemed like it was a long time ago. It was like I turned a corner and Vietnam was a long time ago. And the guys that I see as Vietnam veterans aren't young guys. They're not in their 20s or 30s or even 40s anymore. they're in their 60s. And I look at a Vietnam veteran now, and I can't even believe it. I can't conceive of a Vietnam veteran being anything other than a 20-year-old. You know, and I see these Vietnam veterans, and they're grizzled old guys like me, and some of them are riding motorcycles, and some of them have jobs on Wall Street, and I can't see that. Well, as I said earlier, when I first got to Vietnam, they assigned me as a door gunner, and I think I flew for about 2 months. But after that, since I had gone to aviation high school and I opened my big mouth about it, they knew that I knew about power plants. My major knowledge was in reciprocating engines. It wasn't in turbines. But at that point in time, the person in charge of the engine shop in that unit was going home. And the two guys that were in the engine shop didn't want the job. They didn't want the responsibility. So they put me in charge of the engine shop. And for the rest of my tour, my 2 tours actually, I was the non-commissioned officer in charge of the engine shop. During the Cambodian invasion, and forever on, I serviced helicopters. Occasionally I would go up as a gunner. I'd fly last light, sometimes with the scout ship. But pretty much my job for the rest of my time in Vietnam was as an aircraft engine repairman. You know, actually, I liked Vietnam. I liked being there. I liked the countryside. I liked the fact that it was the greenest planet on Earth. I haven't seen green since as intense as Vietnam was. And I remember when I was leaving it for the second time, because I had done 2 tours and I had come home on leave after my first tour, that when I was going to step onto the stairs going up to the plane, that when my foot leaves Vietnam, I'll never go back again. I remember that. And I kind of regretted it, because I kind of liked it over there. As I said earlier, the most exotic thing to me was Prospect Park in Brooklyn when I was a kid. All of a sudden, I'm in Vietnam. It's the most exotic place in the world. Palm trees, rice paddies, little Vietnamese people with conical helmets, hats, water buffaloes, and Viet Cong even. You know, it was so different to me. Apart from the Viet Cong part, I really loved Vietnam. I liked it. And that's why I wanted to go back. And I went back. There was 4 letters in the alphabet that no one ever heard of at that point, and it was PTSD. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, didn't exist when I came home, and I was fully immersed into it. And back in those days, they just told you to get it together, you're home now, get your life together, you don't even have to think about it anymore. It wasn't that easy. I was in bad shape when I came home. I did crazy things when I came home. At one point, I decided I wanted to take up skydiving. So I took a drive to New Jersey. I think it was Lakewood, New Jersey. And I signed up to take a skydiving course. And back in those days, they put a parachute on you. You went out on your own. There was no buddy system or anything like that. And my first jump, I met this woman, this girl, who ended up being my jumping partner for 2 years. And we got married. And I have to say that that woman saved my life, because without her, I think I would have been dead. I don't think I would have survived. And I've been married to her for 36 years, I believe. I lose track, actually. But that's how I met my wife. I learned that there were different flavors of fear. You know, like there's fear of the dark, and there's fear of heights, and there's fear of not passing your math test. But there was nothing like the fear I felt when someone was shooting at me. It was sort of like a dread. It was sort of like a low in the stomach fear. When we used to get incoming at night, we used to get rocket attacks at night. I always thought that it And it never happened, but I always felt that it was going to be preceded by or it was preceding a ground attack. And I'd get this dread in my stomach. It wasn't like a panic or anything. It was just like oh no, I really don't want this to happen fear. I have never felt that fear again. When the day I left Vietnam, that fear left, but I still remember it. I still remember that flavor of fear.